Damanhur and Falco. One who dares to fly with eagles and soar with the angels. The eternal search for spirit always seems to bring one in contact with Damanhur. 2001 was my first journey and experience with Damanhur. Now 21 years later in 2022, it is finally the right time to release this information. This is my journey into what some have called the eighth wonder of the world, a very special community at the time, with around 800 people living in a state of spirituality. The foundation of this community started with a few men meeting up and deciding to build a temple in a mountain in Italy. The site was selected because of the meeting of the magnetic grid lines or meridians at this site. Initially 4 or 5 men began digging into the mountain by pickaxe and using buckets to excavate what would be called the Temple of Mankind. The design would be dug in 7 sections. The reason it was called the Temple of Mankind was the design would have 7 sections, all connecting. This would be designed in accordance with the human body having 7 chakras. Each section would have a separate purpose, connecting each part of the temple to the whole. Over the course of 25 years, this small dig has become a feat that is being called one of the modern wonders of the world. The community of 10 would blossom into a spiritual center and community striving to be self-sufficient. This community has developed into over 800 people on site and over 400 members off-site. Damanhur has become a model for other spiritual and self-sufficient communities worldwide. They have also begun to have an international appeal, allowing members and honorary citizens worldwide. This community flourishes and focuses on the arts, medicine, music, and culture. Within the community is housing shared between 10 to 12 families, all living or sharing one large dwelling. The money and costs are shared as if a family was one unit and take care of each other's needs. The cooking is taken up by one person and changes each night. Each person contributes to the household chores separately. The spiritual community elects leaders to set up laws and lead the community development. It has become an independent country within a country in a sense. A battle of a political nature between the Italian government and Damanhur was reached through a settlement. The agreement was that Damanhur would no longer exist as a secretive community only open to its members. Damanhur would now open it and its temple doors to the world. It now allows visitors and new residents. Damanhur still operates under a blanket of secrecy that very few outsiders are allowed to penetrate. I was blessed enough to live amongst the Damanhurians and be invited into their very private mystical world. I was also made to be a Damanhurian citizen while living there. This community has sacred ceremonies, including a sacred language stemming from very ancient times. I was even allowed to spend a magical night in the Temple of Mankind. I was given full access to roam anywhere in the temple I choose to visit, which I did alone. Only 10 of us were allowed to participate in this life-altering experience. I would live amongst them for over 8 months. I will share my experiences and changes I have experienced personally over this time. It is sometimes our destiny to go through dark times in order to find the light at the end of the tunnel. My story begins there. I was experiencing personal and business problems which forced me to evaluate my entire life. I was studying spirituality, medicine, physics and permaculture when they all seemed to meet in the middle. All paths seemed to meet at one, as they say. I was using the internet when I stumbled across the site for Damanhur. It seemed too incredible to be true. At first, I thought it must be the typical internet hype. Then, I began to have dreams about the place. The second time I dreamed about it, there seemed to be a longing in my soul to pursue it. I found myself drawn to visit Italy again. In the midst of turmoil, it was calling my name like a sacred place of refuge. I still had my doubts. I did not even know where Damanhur was located. I would depart, initially going to Rome. I had been there before and figured I would feel out whether things would fall in place for me to visit. After a few weeks in Italy, I decided to look up where in Italy Damanhur was located. I called a number for Damanhur and found out I had to fly into the Torino airport. I booked a flight at a local travel agency, and by some strange coincidence, there were no hotel rooms available. I found it strange that in a town large enough to hold the Olympics, there was not one room available. I decided if I felt compelled to go, I would not worry, I would go in faith that everything would work out. I arrived at the airport in Torino and was unable to get the phone to work in the airport. Everyone from the flight was picked up, and I was left standing alone in the airport for about 15 minutes. I looked out of place, like a typical American tourist lost in Italy. Out of nowhere, a beautiful young Italian girl asked me if I needed help. I explained my situation to her. She said she would call Damanhur for me from her information desk. She placed several calls, and within minutes she said someone would pick me up from Damanhur within the hour. She said she had also explained the hotel situation to them, and they said I could stay at the facilities at Damanhur. I spoke no Italian, yet things just seemed to fall into place. The man who picked me up spoke very little English, however, we were able to connect on a higher level. It was amazing on the drive up the mountain. There was this familiar feeling of going home. It is hard to describe the feeling of being in another country, yet upon arriving at Damanhur, it was as if going to a dimension back in time. The people upon arriving were very helpful, and went out of their way to accommodate me. Even though they had hardly any notice I was coming, they had made all arrangements. I was greeted by Gaza. She made arrangements for me to stay above the headquarters of Damanhur. The facility was great and had a joint kitchen everyone shared. I was taken on a tour of Damanhur the next day. Damanhur is a community within a community. The main gated community is used as a central meeting place for the people who live in the various districts. All the various arts are practiced and workshops are right there. They have sculptures, painters, goldsmiths, ceramics, glass makers, alchemists, musicians, self-care shops, etc. The statues and theme of the property resembles a combination of Atlantis and Egypt. The second night my brain was overwhelmed by all I had just taken in. They assign you a wristband as a guest to indicate your temporary membership to the community. I had a roommate from Italy who spoke English. He was young, yet a very successful entrepreneur. He said he had been going to Damanhur for years and used it as a retreat. He had helped design and promote their website. He said not to worry, it had taken him years of visiting for a week or two for all the facets of Damanhur to sink in. The next day I met an American classical pianist and world-renowned medium. The pianist was from California and Peter, the medium, lived at Mount Shasta. They were there with a group that booked their trip 6 months in advance. They invited me to join their group to see the inside and inner workings of Damanhur. This would provide me with an opportunity to experience the inside track most visitors were not able to experience. The next day I was invited to go to a meeting with the elders of Damanhur. We were invited to a question and answer session with some of the founders. In our group, there was an electronic expert present who had just happened to have designed the zapper for Dr. Hulda Clark. He was also a philosopher, and his inquiries into Damanhur were like being involved in discussions between Plato and Socrates. The only difference being that these were some of the greatest minds of our modern times. I felt privileged to be a part of these discussions. The conversations covered topics from our existence. Why is the age-old saying what is above is the same as below, medical breakthroughs of Damanhur, how to change one's vibration, the inner workings of prana. We even touched on the subject of time travel, which Damanhur was involved using advanced Tesla technology to affect the molecules of the body in what they had called cabins. We only touched on the subject, as it was more of a private research project. They normally didn't discuss the particulars of it with outsiders. I had just recently been working with the head of Harvard Quantum Physics Department, Dr. Fox, on particle acceleration via email. At Harvard, they had recently been using a particle accelerator to increase the cell's vibration toward the speed of light. No disease cells could survive after being accelerated. The doctor also confirmed his belief if we could accelerate our body's cells similar to Back to the Future or Star Trek. He believed the same theories as the Damanhurians. The interesting part was Damanhur's leader, Falco, had been working on this technology for over 20 years. Everyone in the community had been drawn to live there, bringing various skills and all their resources and pooling them together. He had some of the best minds, and the financial ability to experiment without outside interference. At this meeting, we also learned how they took ancient alchemy and used modern technology to advance it in the Temple of Mankind. The Temple of Mankind, we found out, was built specifically into the heart of a sacred mountain. They had also used the world's largest amount of copper to wrap around the Temple of Mankind. They were also creating an ancient form of spiritual art called Selfika. Selfika at Damanhur was taken to another level and involved all aspects of life at Damanhur. That evening we were invited to dinner by a woman named Pelicano. We would dine at one of the founders' homes, which had a small restaurant attached for members of Damanhur. We drove up various hills past several of the Damanhurian homes to a guarded gate. Once inside, we passed more Damanhurian homes and fields laid out with various symbols and drawings. Arriving at the restaurant, we were shown a sacred tree. Everyone greeted by placing your forehead on the tree along with both of your palms in the form of a greeting on the tree. The sacred tree was the oldest in the area. Right outside the restaurant home was the Selfika maze in various ancient patterns lined with multicolored stones. There was an electronic energy field and a special medallion one activates around your neck once one enters the field. At first we were only allowed glances at all this. We could tell we were honored just to be invited to even get glimpses into their world. Lee was the organizer of the American group. He was interested in starting an international group community there at Damanhur. The communities were divided up by various provinces. The core group lived and worked inside the provinces of Damanhur. They grew their own food, had animals, factories, created their own clothing for ceremonies. They had a college for those Damanhurians wishing to learn sacred language, color, light, and sound. They also had various courses in spirituality and medicine for the Damanhurians. The next day we were scheduled for a tour of the Temple of Mankind. That evening we spent discussing all we had been encountering. The next morning, we piled into a bus and took cars up to the mountain. We were greeted at the gate by some of the guardians of the temple. The temple is not visible, and just looks like a mountain with a house on it. We were taken past the side of the house to a secret entrance. This prevents anyone from entering the temple without permission. We began the tour in the section they call the Hall of Mirrors. This room was a giant half-domed room, all mirrored. There were amazing painted murals. We began the tour, receiving explanations for each room we would travel to. There were hidden doors and passages, like something right out of the Tomb Raider movie. In the middle of the tour, we entered an area behind a trick wall where there were these high-tech devices. I knew this had been what I was waiting to see. We were then informed we were the first outsiders allowed to see the new cabin. It was larger than the first cabin. The first was only big enough to hold 2 people. This cabin could hold up to 5 people. It was circular, with large cylindrical tubes connected with copper, electricity, and crystals. I asked if this was where they were experimenting with time travel. Gaza replied with a grin, saying she would discuss that with me at another time. I had been studying Tesla technology and particle accelerators prior to my visit to Damanhur. This is how I surmised what the technology of what they called a cabin was. It was very Star Trek, yet I had just enough understanding to recognize what I was viewing as I entered the cabin. The term cabin was just a name they had given this machine and mechanism. We proceeded to enter each room of the temple, one seeming more amazing than the next. It is hard to describe a room in which you enter it and literally are in a state of awe due to its magnificence. Later I will walk you through each room and their significance. Once we left the temple, we were all still overcome by what we just experienced. The level of spirituality encompassing present, past, and future mere words could not describe the experience. I have experienced the pyramids in Egypt after experiencing the temple. I would say that the temple in Damanhur was what I would imagine experiencing the pyramids in their days of glory and splendor. The Damanhurians have followed the vision of Falco and the founders to incorporate all ancient spiritual knowledge and expound upon it. It is truly amazing what a group of people focused on a particular goal can achieve in a quarter of a century. The next amazing experience was we were invited to partake in the ritual of walking the sacred Selfika maze. The purpose was a journey of the inward meeting the outward as one journeyed throughout the maze. We arrived at one of the founders' homes. He proceeded to educate us as to the nature of the stone Selfika spirals we would enter. He activated the force field and gave us special medallions to enter the maze. You could feel the difference in the energy level of the maze once the force field was activated. We were allowed to enter the labyrinth 2 people at a time. Something seemed to change as we walked from the inside, finding our way back out. We were allowed as much time as we would like or felt like we needed inside the labyrinth. Once I entered the labyrinth, I felt the difference immediately. Something changed in that short journey. I received some kind of inner awakening, a piece of self. They say if one is open, one finds what it needs. I decided that day that I wanted to move there and live amongst these people, learning all I could. Over the next 10 days, we met and experienced all kinds of wonderful facets of Damanhur. I had been there 14 days, yet I had not even scratched the surface of Damanhur. During this time, Peter, the medium, had seen the presence of Tesla and others participating with my experience. I was studying quantum physics for the first time in my life. I wondered how I could understand all I had been learning and experiencing so quickly. I just allowed myself to be open to all that was happening on my journey. I decided to go pack up my place in Rome and move to Damanhur. Once back in Rome, I immediately purchased a 2-seater motorcycle I would have shipped to Damanhur. I was packed and ready to return within 4 days. I was traveling with 8 large bags, not including all my scuba gear. I flew back into Torino and was picked up by someone different at the airport. This time my soul seemed to have felt a connection or past bond with this person who picked me up. Life always seems to have its reasons. He could speak very little English, yet on our trip back we managed to discuss a little of everything I wanted to know about his life at Damanhur. It turns out he was asked to pick me up at the last minute. He had been one of the pioneers in the cabin time travel experiments. I asked all kinds of questions on our trip from the airport. Once arriving back, I was greeted by Pelicano. She said she could let me stay long-term at a guest house called Atlan. The guest house was called Atlan after the headquarters of Atlantis. This was a giant 2-story house with a huge balcony area. Each room was typically split between 2 to 4 guests. I was blessed enough to get an entire room to myself. I had brought an entire recording studio that I would set up in half my room. I had so much stuff, from books to clothes, that the entire room was filled as soon as I moved in. I was introduced to BEA Nancy, a young beautiful red-headed German girl who took care of the guest house. I was away from my daughter, who was 3. BEA Nancy had a son, Avalon, who was 3 years old, which I would interact with. He had never met his father. There was another permanent house guest from southern Italy, named Josie. The house would receive visitors from the US and other parts of the world every week. I was allowed access to the central area of Damanhur day and night. Luckily, there was a Damanhurian grocery store within walking distance. This store also served lunch and dinner for a small fee. My motorcycle took 2 weeks to arrive by train. The motorcycle allowed me to explore all parts of Damanhur. I began to venture out to the various districts of Damanhur. Each district was focused on a different aspect, from farming to engineering. I was also invited to dinner at various families' houses. I also began to explore the mountains and various streams surrounding the area. Now that I had transportation and people realized I was a resident, not a visitor, people's attitudes changed. I was welcomed by the leaders of the community, making it easy to settle in with the rest of the community. Having transportation enabled me to be a host to the guests staying at the guest house. Damanhur had drawn spiritual people from all over the world. There was a variety of guests who had usually traveled and visited other communities all over the world. It was interesting to watch each person that came to visit become overwhelmed with amazement about how much knowledge was present at Damanhur. Most people had an immediate desire to return to visit, as they knew a week or two only allowed one to scratch the surface of Damanhur. For over 20 years, Damanhur remained an isolated secret society. Only because of an action by the Italian government, which causes the Damanhurians to become an item of the media, did they decide to open up their community to the world via the internet and small group visits. The response was incredible. They have had to create staff specifically to handle the influx of visitors. In the community, there are various gift shops containing spiritual jewelry, various arts and crafts, and clothing produced by the Damanhurians. Falco, the leader and visionary founder, also displays selfika paintings that combine special selfika and colors, making one-of-a-kind pieces. The interesting part of each art piece is people seem to be attracted to one individual piece that seems to call to them. Each painting has an individual energy and message. The community of Damanhur is based around spiritual growth. Damanhur offers courses for the citizens to grow and share their knowledge, helping one another. The community elects leaders, however. Falco, in my personal experience, was still the active visionary and continued to help guide his community. I could get my first glimpse inside the man by attending a once-a-week lecture he held. This meeting consisted of a topic of lecture selected by Falco. Then following would be a question and answer session. The topics ranged from spiritual to quantum physics to their time travel experiments. I met the chief quantum physics expert and head Damanhurian scientist. His knowledge was vast and extensive. I was able to meet with him fairly regularly as I lived there. I would ask various questions, then research the technology of our discussions. I had owned and rode horses while living in Australia. I missed riding, and so I inquired who owned horses at Damanhur. I was told there was one gentleman who had horses, was the last gentleman who had picked me up at the airport to move to Damanhur. He remembered me and felt comfortable enough to meet me without the interpreter. We arranged a time to go riding the following week. He initially brought the horses to me where I was living at Damanhur. I thought his name sounded familiar. That evening, as I was reading some of the articles on various Damanhurian time travel experiences, I came across his name. I was amazed to discover he had been involved with the experiments since the beginning. The day he arrived to go riding, he let me know we would be touring the surrounding area and Damanhur. He was very pleased that I could ride well. I inquired about the experiments and his experiences with the cabin. He explained that the first cabin held only 2 people. Over time, they developed a 5-person cabin. He explained they were only able to back in time and used special selfika devices to help guide their journey. I had been studying time travel experiments since I was 24. For those who this may seem Star Trek or science fiction, I suggest you read about the Philadelphia experiment and Montauk project that occurred in the U.S. since as early as World War II using Tesla technology. Nikola Tesla was beyond his time even in the late 1800s. He had developed wireless transmission, which we now use for cellular phones. He was also responsible for our current electrical system. His technology is even being used in the government's HAARP program, including our current atomic accelerators. The next time we met to go riding, he invited me to his community and house. He lived in what they call the sacred woods. The road next to his house was lined by one of the longest and largest stone-structured ancient Selfica designs. These designs were similar to the labyrinth we entered at the restaurant, except the entire road in and around the compound was lined with multicolored stones, making up the various patterns. All these rocks were connected and had an electrical field that could be activated. Once I arrived at his home, I noticed multicolored pyramid structures in the yard and all types of ancient symbols drawn on his home. I had studied ancient patterns and symbols. I understood from living in Australia some of the meanings, as I was taught by the indigenous peoples of Australia, the Aborigines, why they use certain patterns and colours together. I reached the stables, and he was waiting on me to go riding. Today he said he would take me into parts of the sacred woods that most Damanhurians had not experienced. I knew I was honoured to be given such a privilege. The places we encountered while riding that day were amazing. I went to special spiritual places and returned filled with questions. We spent hours talking about all the various stages of the time travel experiments that occurred since the beginning stages. The amount of time he would be gone in Earth time might only be 15 minutes, or a little more. The problem, he explained, was that once the body physically disappeared, as in the Star Trek chamber, the human body began losing 1 pound of water every 2 to 3 minutes. He told me where to go on the Damanhur website to read some of the log travels in English. He invited me into his home to meet his family and residents that all currently shared his home. He told me prior to my departure that I could visit the property and ride the horses without an invitation. I was now treated as if I was one of the family. Around this time, the woman I had expected from Aruba arrived at Damanhur. She fit in right away, and it helped that she spoke 7 languages. The ability to speak other languages and translate for me opened other doors. I began to venture out to other cities in the surrounding areas. Unlike the area we were living in, these were more metropolitan. The city of Torino had real stores similar to Kmart and large grocery stores. Even in these metropolitan cities, I was impressed how the Damanhurians still had an everyday presence, even there. It was a sort of spiritual revolution, or awakening affecting everyone the Damanhurians came into contact with. Upon her arrival to Damanhur, I decided to begin her journey with the Temple of Mankind. She was amazed at all the different facets of Damanhur. We were fortunate enough to be able to visit the Temple of Mankind fairly regularly. Usually people only had 1 or 2 opportunities if they were lucky enough to visit. We went to a meeting held by Falco discussing various Damanhurian topics, and a new discovery by the Damanhurian scientists. The discovery was made utilizing a special type of photography. This new type of photography allowed them to capture images that had left a field of energy behind after they were no longer there. An example would be, say they were taking a picture of an area that was burned down or currently had a building where trees were previously cleared. This photography would show what images, say trees, were on the site prior to the clearing. This new photography allowed them to take a picture of what stood there in the past before building. The way it was explained to us was that the photography was picking up the previous energy field. This technology was similar to the new Carillion photography, allowing one to view energy fields around the body. The difference was this was allowing a new time kingdom, as they called the energy the new photography was picking up. The Damanhurians were still experimenting and attempting to better understand this new technology they had discovered. He also talked of changes in Damanhur. He felt it was now up to the people of Damanhur to continue the vision. He also talked of a desire for an international community or communities to follow suit in technology, research, and spiritual growth. It is difficult to imagine someone considered an avatar, a spiritual leader, visionary, world-renowned artist, business person, scientist, husband, philosopher, and remained so down to earth as a person. I was impressed by his knowledge, sincerity, honesty, and ability to just be human, exposing himself to everyone at such a real level. My first encounter one-on-one personally meeting Falco was at his and Damanhur's birthday party. I felt privileged to be invited and honored to meet him personally. I passed along a sacred spiritual gift I had brought with me. I had felt compelled to give it to him on this occasion. He was very grateful and acknowledged his appreciation, as well as his gratitude to keep it. I met his wife and new son on a separate occasion. At this celebration, new Damanhurians would come up to the podium and receive a new spiritual name that everyone would call them. I videotaped portions of the event, which was also a privilege to be allowed to do. Upon my interaction with Falco, I felt a past life bond one would not understand until much later. I was also allowed the privilege of videotaping at Damanhur, as well as some of Falco's largest paintings, which were about to be shipped as they were already sold. Each painting being a sacred piece of art, the ability to capture some of the pieces I felt drawn to was indeed an honor. I did not realize at the time how these paintings would affect me and my dreams I would have at Damanhur until one day much later I would understand these synchronicities. I also found a shop at Damanhur where I purchased sacred medallions and selfika jewelry I would wear. Each piece was activated for each individual prior to wearing a piece. Some of the pieces of jewelry were only selfika, and some incorporated alchemy. Once I experienced the jewelry and their effects, I was now more intrigued than ever. I had become friends with a female artist and clothing designer. She had asked if I would mind spending time with her husband, who was English. It seemed he did not speak Italian, as she did, and missed intellectual conversation in English. They had lived at Damanhur for a few years and shed new light to various issues I had questions about. This also allowed me some pleasant outings to water parks and places with their children I never would have experienced. The clothing designer had made the special clothing for the various events, such as ceremonies and the birthday party. She asked if I would video her line of clothing. During this session, I had the first opportunity to purchase some shirts containing special designs with the sacred language and various symbols. I still consider these shirts among some of my most treasured collection of clothing. They seem to have a presence all their own. Each shirt was designed with a color and symbol to help one spiritually. They are all handmade and one of a kind. Symbology and clothing, including jewelry, are not necessary in achieving the spiritual place I want to achieve. However, I could tell in my artistic, spiritual, and overall well-being was improved when wearing these Damanhurian items. I felt it was time to branch out from Asian where I was living. I felt spirit would help me select where to move to. I put it out to the universe, and the day I intended to move, the Italian girl, who also resided at Asian, Josie, came to me and said she felt like I had to move in with this French couple who recently built a mansion on a sacred spiritual spot on top of a mountain right next to Damanhur. At first I was hesitant, and after much insistence by Josie and her friend Isabella, I agreed to meet the couple. In Italy I met the woman. Her name was Lona, and she was a famous sculptor and artist. Her spiritual mate, Zar, was out of town. I told her of my skepticism and that I planned on moving in a day or so. She said she felt like I should see the place, as they had not rented to anyone because they were waiting for the right spiritual people to come. She felt like we might be them. She offered to drive us up the mountain in her truck. The place was right out of a movie. A mansion right on top of this mountain overlooking a small town with a view that is indescribable. She showed us the brand new 2-story section of this mansion that would be our new home. I had lived in many beautiful places and had owned mansions, so I was not blown away by all this. The house had its own sacred woods with a stream, and the energy of the land was even stronger than I felt at Damanhur. I told her we were interested, she said to give her a few moments at her side of the house to ask her spiritual guides if we were the people they had been waiting on. When she returned, she said, "Let's go pack up your stuff, I will help you move." We returned to Asian, packed up, and within 3 hours were now unpacking in our new home. It took me a week or two to get over how spirit works, and when we just allow ourselves to be in the flow, things just seem to evolve. I continued my contact with the friends I made at Damanhur, as well as the overall community. It was amazing how once we moved from the guest house at Damanhur, the Damanhurians opened up even more, as we were now residents, not guests. We met Zar, Lona's spiritual partner, who was also a healer working at a Damanhurian health clinic in Torino. We began sharing information and growing as a spiritual unit. We worked together to raise our spiritual vibration while living together. I continued my horseback riding and Damanhurian research. I was now incorporating what I had learned at Damanhur, as well as my continued studies while living at our new home. I also was creating music at a remarkable rate of inspiration coming from my spiritual growth and longing I had to see my daughter. I realized I must follow my journey, yet I still felt like a part of me was missing without Leilani. I also began various types of channeling while living at my new home. I began making selfika items without being taught. I also began doing paintings, a special type of art I call ancient energy paintings. I had never done art or really had any inclination to. Here I was channeling these paintings out of a divine inspiration. During this period, the gentleman I had been riding with, I found out, was the only person at Damanhur to travel back in time and return with something physical from the period he traveled to. Once I found this out, the next time I saw him, I had to know his version of what happened. He explained he and someone called Gorilla, that is the English translation of his Damanhurian name, were the two most experienced at Damanhur. He explained their lack of success at their time travel experiments until one time, the selves, as they call the devices, took them to school on how to travel. The school consisted of a type of training allowing them to travel, but more importantly, how to find their way back. He explained on one of his journeys he wanted to know if he could return with something to show himself he actually could return with something. He explained that a portal, or gate, was how they would enter a different dimension. Upon this travel, on his return he grabbed a handful of grass, and upon his return the people were amazed that he could return with some physical evidence from another era. At this time, Damanhur was offering a class for Damanhurians who wanted to participate in the time travel experiments. My friend offered to help me if I wanted to participate. I considered his offer, yet with thoughts of my daughter, I did not feel I wanted to put myself in harm's way just for the sake of my own curiosity. Even if I achieved this, I knew in my heart it would make no difference in achieving my spiritual goals I had set out to achieve on Earth. I was invited to experience a once-in-a-lifetime event by the Damanhurians. Myself and the woman from Aruba would be allowed to spend the night in the Temple of Mankind. We would be given full access to all 7 sections of the temple all through the night. This would take place on a special equinox. We would be 2 of only 7 people invited to attend. I had no idea what to expect, but I knew I could not pass up such an opportunity. That evening, we entered the room with all the mirrors and dome-shaped roof. The room was massive. They asked us to sit down on some pillows and began a meditation. After striking a gigantic gong, they cranked up some kind of generator, which sounded as if the entire mountain and structure might take off. It was a specially designed room, and we never found out what the frequency was said to do. We all felt different after they activated this device, however. We were now free to roam the temple. I went to all the rooms, however. I spent most of the night in one room. I was in the Hall of Spheres. This magical room contained 7 spheres, all different colors, with a strange alchemical liquid in them. These were like gigantic crystal balls, each on their own altar. I spent time with each sphere, yet I felt drawn to a clear sphere at the head of the hall. Sometime in the night I grabbed a chair and felt compelled to rest my forehead on the sphere. I was linking my third eye, as they call it, right in the middle of the forehead. This is not an actual eye, but in the spiritual world this chakra is considered our third eye, or spiritual center. At some point, a massive amount of information were going into my brain. I stayed on the sphere until my brain felt completely full. I had never ever experienced so much information in my life. My brain felt completely full and almost hurt. I decided to go to bed. When I awoke, it was as if I had digested all the information I had received, yet had no recall. Shortly after that, I began channeling and creating things like selfika, the paintings and crystal wands. I went through various phases to activate the paintings, as well as the selves I had created. When Zar and I measured the energy level of these items, we now had to create entirely new scales to measure them. I had began creating things while channeling that I am not sure I could even recreate, with one of them in front of me. I can only create these things when I am inspired and in a channeling mode. I am just creating them through divine guidance, not thought. I do not set out with instructions. I am just led to do certain things, and after days or hours, the item or painting is complete. I am also entirely focused on completing the project and do not stop except for limited sleep and snacking type food. Another amazing event took place. My spiritual partner at the time and I decided to have a child. We were both at such a high vibration and in a very spiritual place. When we conceive this child, he will surely be a special child. I believe all my children, which I now have 3, Leilani Juliana Piramale, an absolutely heavenly child, the child I spoke of conceiving, Jamiel James Youssef, and my most recent little angel, Michael Joshua Piramale. My first child at 2 years old was already telling me she was a healer. She is now 5 and very spiritually gifted. James is a year and a half and already visits me spiritually. My youngest, Josh, is 6 months and communicates with me mentally. I am truly blessed. I am now going to explain the Damanhurians' belief regarding our current lives here on Earth. During my stay with Lona and Zar, I discovered my link to Damanhur and Falco. The Damanhurians believe that each person has 8 subtle bodies, which reincarnate, and that each person carries around at least one of these from a previous life. The benefit is, as we experience each life on Earth, we can have a variety of experiences simultaneously. Zar had done a past life reading for me, and it seemed Falco and I had shared similar energy to allow me to preform my new works of art and selfika creations. The same rang true with my new discovery of ancient symbols. He also believed we all shared experiences in Atlantis, Egypt, and now in this life again. That evening, Falco came to me in a dream. I decided to test the theory and focused on visiting him the next evening. I went to sleep. The experiment was a success. I now began to focus on incorporating music, color, art, and symbols into my life. The result was several months of some incredible art pieces, selfika, and even some other devices incorporating crystals, stones, and copper selfika. I was now growing spiritually at a fantastic rate. I slowly grew out of my desire to surround myself with Damanhur, yet it would always be a major part of my journey. During this time, I also traveled to Egypt. Just like with Damanhur, things seemed to take shape. I allowed a travel agent to make all arrangements and let spirit guide my month-long journey. Zar and Lona would be leaving for a vacation and just happened to be able to take us to the airport the same day they scheduled a trip. We stayed at the Ramses Hilton. I had been told by Zar that I had been Ramses in one of my previous lives. I did not plan to stay at the Ramses Hilton. The travel agent just said he would include a hotel in the package. Upon arrival, I immediately asked the concierge. He told me the best way was to book a driver for the whole day. I was not sure at first as to how much a taxi and driver would cost each day for weeks, if not an entire month. I only planned on staying in Cairo for 2 weeks. I asked how much, and he said he would reserve someone he thought was right for me. I wasn't sure what he meant, but being exhausted from the all-day affair of travel, I agreed. The next morning I was called down to the concierge's desk to meet my soon-to-be guide. I inquired about price, and to my surprise, he said $20 a day for his services. I inquired about gas, and he said it would be all-inclusive. I had a good feeling about him, and for $20 a day, how could I refuse? He initially started with a basic tour of Cairo. During our tour, he said he had a familiar feeling about me. He asked if this was my coming home. I informed him this was my first trip to Egypt. He said that was not what he meant. He then asked me if I believed in previous lives. I said yes, and he said he believed I was to meet him, and that he would arrange a special tour. At first I did not understand, as I would over time. The next day I was taken to a special camel tour only for locals, not tourists. Upon my arrival there, I received the same welcoming from our guide. He said it has been a long time since you have been back. This time I just followed their lead. We rode camels up to the pyramids. Upon arriving at the first pyramid, I could see tourists way off in the distance. They were not allowed near the pyramids. At the first pyramid site, we were walking next to the pyramid when the tour guide informed me they had just uncovered the largest statue of Ramses, and that I should inform the statue it was okay to leave this place. It seemed they had tried to remove it to no avail. I was told I could be the first person to touch or even lay on the statue if I desired. I decided to lay on the statue, and even though it was an odd request I did, as I was asked with the statue. The woman I was with was capturing all this on my camcorder. As I proceeded to visit the other pyramids, things became even stranger. The first pyramid guide said, "Welcome back. I would like for you to enter the pyramid." I said I was told that people could not enter, and he informed me it would be okay for him to allow us to enter. Sure enough, the military guards allowed him to let us pass and enter the pyramid. He did not want any pay for his services, and I found that very strange. He spent hours with us, taking us through one guard and past another to areas where there were no people, only guards. The next pyramid we entered, some young tour guides had the same type experience, except this pyramid allowed tourists. The guide said, "Please wait here, sir," and proceeded to ask all the tourists to leave each room as we entered. I explained this was not necessary, and they explained that this was my homecoming, and yes, it was. As it would turn out, my passport got lost before the 2 weeks were up, and I was forced to stay in Cairo the entire month. I would not have had all the amazing experiences I continued to have if not for the inconvenience of a lost passport. I received a letter to travel right before my return to Italy. I returned to Italy and Damanhur even stronger than I had left. I now had a ton of other questions I would inquire about, and my arts reached new heights.